Today we're going to cover elevator access control and how you set that up within ACM. Before we dive into the configuration, let's talk about what elevator access control is. Now typically you have a card reader mounted in an elevator cab, and when the user presents a valid credential, it allows them to select the floors they are authorized to go to. Now one thing we should note here, if you're mounting a card reader by the call button, this type of scenario where you're just interrupting the call button doesn't require the steps that we're going to cover in today's tutorial. In that scenario, you would just set up the reader just like you would a regular door. Now, there's two different methods used when setting up elevator access control. The first is software-based. Now, we're not going to go into that today because that requires custom integration services and using the REST API. What we are going to cover is the hardware-based method. And this is where, again, you have the card reader mounted in the elevator cab. And then back at the elevator control room, you're wiring outputs from ACM to inputs on the elevator controller. And in the case of using feedback, as we'll talk about later, you're going to actually bring outputs from the elevator controller back to inputs on ACM. So I mentioned feedback previously. Feedback also is known as floor tracking, and when you use elevator feedback, this tells you which floor the actual user selected. Now with elevator no feedback, the user presents their card, they select whatever floor they're allowed or authorized to go to, and you don't know which floor they actually selected. Now, as far as hardware requirements, you're going to need at least one controller. Now, this controller does not have to be dedicated to elevator control, so it can have standard doors connected to other subpanels. Now, keep in mind, you can use the internal card reader port on a 1501 or 1502 for the cab reader. However, the inputs and outputs on the controller cannot be used for elevator control. So our next requirement is a subcontroller. If you have 6 doors or less, you can use an MR52. If you're beyond 6 floors, you're going to need an MR16 out. Now, if you're going to use elevator control with feedback, you can additionally use an MR16 in. Now, keep in mind there is a limit of 8 total subpanels that can be used for controlling one elevator cab, which gives you 128 floors per cab. Now, one final note, once a subcontroller is designated for elevator access control, the inputs and outputs on that board can only be used for elevator control. You cannot use those spare inputs and outputs for any other functions. Now, let's talk about the card reader in the elevator cab. You need to be mindful of your cable limits. In the case of Wiegand, you can go up to 500 feet. If you're using an OSDP reader, you can go up to 4,000, depending on what type of cabling you're using and the environment that the cable's installed in. One thing to consider is mounting an MR50 in the elevator cab with the reader. Again, that's going to take you beyond that 500-foot limit since you're using RS-485. Now, if you have multiple elevator cabs, something you may want to consider is using a MUX8, which is an RS-485 multiplexer. And that will allow you to home run those MR50s in the elevator cabs back to your controller. Just one final note, just a reminder, most states require that any modifications to the elevator equipment, typically it must be done by a licensed elevator technician. So you'll typically have to partner with your end user's elevator service provider. A couple prerequisites. I'm setting this up in ACM version 5.12.0 service release 2. However, this will probably work in previous versions as well. I'm also going to assume that you have already installed your Mercury hardware as well as your card reader, and everything's connected to the appropriate elevator equipment. Now, I'm going to walk through a configuration example. In my example, I'm going to set up elevator with feedback. I'm going to control 6 floors. And I'm going to use an MR52 as my subcontroller. Okay, so let's dive into the actual configuration. Now I've already set everything up on my system, so I'm just going to walk you through the steps. After you sign into ACM, the first thing we're going to need to do is go to the subcontroller that you've designated for elevator control. And we're going to tell it that the inputs and outputs are going to be used for elevator control. So we're going to select our subpanel. Down here where it says elevator inputs and elevator outputs, we're going to put a check mark by each of these. If we were not using feedback, you would not need to check elevator inputs. Okay, now from here, what we're going to do is we're going to actually set up a door for the elevator cab reader. Now I realize that the reader is in an elevator cab, but it's still done under the doors configuration. So here I've already set up an elevator cab reader. For access type, we're going to select elevator with feedback. You would say no feedback if you're not using feedback. I'm going to set my door mode for card only. Now I'm just going to go with the defaults on the operations tab. If you have a unique card format, you would apply it here. Then I'm going to go to hardware. Now, one of the things that's important is to make sure under elevator outputs and elevator inputs, you tell it which subcontrollers you're using. And in a previous step, I showed you where you designate a subcontroller for elevator control. When you do that, those devices will be populated in the drop-down list here. Also, we need to make sure that we select the reader. In this case, I've already labeled it as elevator cab 1, reader 1. Now from here, after you save that, you can go over to the elevator tab and you can label your actual levels. In my case, I just label them level 1 through 6. And then of course you'll save your changes. Now from here, what we'll need to do is create an elevator access level. So we're going to go to roles and we're going to go down to the end of the list here and select elevator access levels. Now I've already created one. I'm going to open this up. Now what I've done is I've basically said in this elevator access level that anybody that has the role that this elevator access level will be assigned to will be able to access any of these 6 floors during business hours. Now, I'm not going to walk through how to set up a schedule, but I've already done that, and basically the schedule is Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Now, before we can add our elevator access level to a role, we have to first add it to an access group. So let's create an access group next. Now I've already done this. So I'm going to name it. I'm going to tell it the schedule that it's active. I'm going to make this 24 hours active. And then here, where it says elevator access level, I need to select the elevator access level that I just created. And also you're going to need to apply the elevator cab reader to this access group. Now the next step, what we need to do here is we need to create a role and add the access group that we just created to that role. So I've already created the role for you. So we're going to open that up. We're going to, again, make sure all of these are installed, the access group and the elevator access level. Now we're going to go to access group and we're going to move the access group over to the members side, and then we're going to save it. Now the next thing I'm going to do after I save this is I'm going to create an identity to test with. So let's go to identities. I've already set one up. It's elevator user 1. So I did the minimum amount of information here, first name, last name. Then I went to roles and I selected my elevator access all floors role, saved those changes, and then I assigned a token. Now that is your final configuration step. Now what you'll want to do from here is you're going to want to download your panel to push all those changes down. So I'm going to go to physical access, then panels. I'm going to click on my panel, which I've already done. Now I'm going to go to reset download. Now, once the panel comes back up, we're going to test this. Okay, so the panel is back online. So let's go over to events and let's see what happens when I present a card. So I presented my card and then I selected level 3. So you can see I got a local grant, and in the messages, it shows which floor I actually selected. Now, if you weren't using feedback, you wouldn't get this additional information under messages. So one final note before we conclude today. I moved through some of the configuration screens pretty quickly, but I did want to note that you need to make sure that you save before you go to the next window. So again, I may not have shown that through every step, but it is important that you save as you go. So that's it. Thank you for watching.